In this video, I will talk about background gradients. A gradient is the merging of two or more colors together in a particular direction. A gradient is applied using the background property. So the gradient is actually a value. First, let's talk about the background property. The background property is actually the shorthand, which allows us to display all of the various background properties. So here we see background colon, the background color, the background image, the background repeat, and the background position. Notice they are not comma separated. If we only used one value with the background property, the browser would assume that the rest of the values are just set at the default, and therefore it would still work with just one value. You commonly will see background gradients being applied in and of themselves to the background property. You might also see them being applied to the background image property. A background gradient acts like a background image. Therefore, you cannot have a gradient and an image at the same time unless you are using a multiple background. The default type of gradient is a linear gradient, and here we are using two colors, red and green, and we see how they merge together. You will also commonly see progressive enhancement used with a background gradient. In the event that the browser does not recognize the gradient code, it will apply the color set here to the background property. To set a linear gradient, at minimum you need two color values, also referred to as color stops. If you are a Photoshop user, you will be familiar with this concept of gradients and the related terminology. So by default, we are getting a 180-degree or straight line gradient going down the container. Background gradients can be applied to containers or to the entire page. We can set an angle at which the gradient will follow. So here the gradient is along a 45-degree angle. Notice the syntax, 45DEG, no spaces. Notice the values are comma separated. Notice that this is a value, the linear gradient value, and in the parentheses takes some additional information to tell the browser more about that gradient. We also can have percents inside our gradient, meaning we can tell the browser how much of a color we wish to display. So here we are using 90% red, which defaults to 10% green. Notice the syntax. There is a space between the red and 90%, and the comma goes after it, indicating the 90% belongs to the red. We also have a repeating linear gradient value. So rather than filling the container, you can repeat the effect. Notice I have an angle and a percent in my values. We also have the ability to code in a radial gradient, and that is the radial gradient value. At minimum, we need two colors, and by default, that will give us an oblong shape. Should we wish to have a circular shape, we can specify the shape, and that would be circle. You can add more colors and percents to the radial gradient also. There are a lot of tools on the internet to help us with some of the more advanced CSS3 code, such as background gradient. The ColorZilla gradient generator is a very popular tool. It will enable you to indicate different values, change settings, and see a preview of what your gradient might look like. It also has a lot of presets from which you can choose. I will choose a preset that goes from blue to transparent. On the right-hand side, you see that they are writing the code. I can copy this code and paste it into my editor. Notice that it gives us the vendor prefixes for Firefox and for WebKit and Safari. Vendor prefixes are generally not needed today. However, they were several years ago. So you can keep them or delete them. So here we see the background property and the linear gradient, and we have a different terminology here to bottom. Sometimes there are also keywords, and they're using RGBA values because of our transparency. And this is the W3 syntax, just the plain background. We also have a backup for IE9 using a specific Microsoft filter code, should you wish to use that. And as you can see, we start with blue, and as we slowly go down, the color becomes a little bit more transparent. Eventually it will change to white if we have more page height. Background gradients are very nice to use, and I highly recommend using some of the tools to find a nice color combination for your website.